The NCECA Roundtable is entering its third year, thanks to a kind of thought tank that some of us participated in with the Chipstone Foundation back in 2013, trying to consider some ideas about how to make the conference experience richer and how to help NCECA address the issues and concerns of those of us working in ceramic arts and ceramic arts related fields, while also understanding that our field takes place within a context of a broader society that we hope to be part of, to affect, to influence, and also to be influenced by. And it's really in that spirit under which this roundtable has evolved. And what we have been trying to do is piggyback, if you will, or build on the shoulders of the ideas of our keynote presenter on the first evening of the conference by bringing together a small group of distinguished thinkers who come at similar issues but from different disciplinary perspectives, if you will. By way of introduction, our presenters today all have incredible professional backgrounds that you can read about on the app in their little presenter bios. I'd like to speak a little bit about how they have influenced me and influenced our decisions to bring them here. So starting at the far end, Hideo Mabuchi has an incredible story and perspective to share with us as a physics professor and MacArthur Fellow and researcher on the science that helps us understand and tell stories about how the universe has evolved and how matter and energy work together. I knew nothing about Hideo and his work until I started talking with Liz, and I'm so happy that she brought him to our attention, because as I've read more about him, it's become only more fascinating. And he's also a potter, which is incredibly awesome, and is working on efforts to bring the sciences and arts together at Stanford in new courses that he's developing. Sitting beside him is Andrea Gill, who many of you know. I've known Andrea for probably 25 years and have had the pleasure of hosting her as a visiting artist and a visit to my home, where I don't know if she remembers, but at that point in time, my wife, who I think is also here in the audience somewhere, was doing large constructions involving shaped canvases and painting and clay, and it was spread across the first floor of our house, probably 20 feet by 30 feet. And Andrea had the most insightful conversation with Denise that I can remember hearing up until that point about that work. And I know that her experience and knowledge as an educator in grappling issues of conversation and discourse and meaning have been important to dozens of people that are part of NCECA's membership. Simone Leigh, I think, is the person that I've come to know this year through multiple phone conversations and email correspondence and some interactions on social media. And I admire her work tremendously. We presented her in the virtual Clay 92Y talk earlier this year. She asks very difficult questions about her own work and her life and role and her attempts to find meaning as an artist. And I think she's asking very important questions of the ceramic community and what our relationship is to ceramic tradition, to materiality, and how we can somehow invert our creative process so as to bring meaning to the forefront and make materiality and our dedication to materiality work in the service of meaning. So thank you so much for being here, Simone. John Borstel is somebody who I've come to know also through conversations with Liz Lerman, and I've come to know him as a very interesting artist. We've had some time to talk, especially last night in the interactions. His work combines photography, performance art, text. It is extremely poetic, extremely personal, and he has tremendous clarity of thought, both as a conversationalist and as a writer. And he is Liz's close collaborator, and I think in a certain way will bring her voice to this conversation. And Ben Carter, I guess I kind of think of as the Bill Moyers of our culture. Those of you who have listened to his podcast know that he is a fantastic listener and asks extremely insightful questions and really digs beneath the surface of the issues. And it's been such an honor to get to know him over the last couple of years and have him work with us on the NCECA podcast. And thank you for being here, Ben, and shepherding this conversation. I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Josh. So for the folks in the audience, I wanted to give you guys a heads up on what's going to happen this morning. This is scheduled to go an hour and a half. We're going to have about 45 minutes to an hour of a roundtable discussion, and then we're going to open it up to questions. You're welcome to ask questions about Liz's talk, and John will be able to address some of those, as well as the other things that the presenters here this morning discuss. When you get up to ask your question, I'm going to want you to go to the microphones, which I believe the closest one will be at the front over in that center aisle. That will allow us to record your questions, which will help in the documentation of this roundtable. We are calling this a roundtable, but as you can see, this is a very straight table. And I tell you that because at some points in this conversation, we might be looking at each other more than looking out at you. That doesn't, however, mean that we don't want you to be an integral part of this discussion. This is going to be a casual conversation based on the ideas that Liz Lerman put forward last night, but also other ideas that will be coming up through this discussion. I thought that I would start with an introduction from Liz's essay, Fueling the Imagination, where she talks about talking with a Nobel laureate and scientist, Dr. Eric Wieschaus, about asking himself questions, how he self-critiques, how he gets into his own mind to generate new ideas. And his response was, "I'm fueled by my own ignorance," which is not a common thought that you would think would come from a Nobel laureate. So from that understanding, Liz writes that not knowing is fuel for the imagination rather than fuel for humiliation. Our discussion today is going to talk and think about how we can engage with work, questions of ourselves and our community, and conversations that generate creativity. So for the panel, I want to put forward that idea of being fueled by your own ignorance. And if you guys can talk a little bit. Thanks.
We are recording, so I need you to talk into microphones.
Okay. So I want to wow, that's a lot louder. I want to pose a question to you guys about how you think about knowing and not knowing in your teaching or in your own work. So I'm thinking about how the core of an idea gets pushed forward into an artwork or to the act of teaching your students. So should we start with Hideo at the end?
Sure. Bringing up this topic of ignorance and how it's an interesting catalyst, I mostly think about in physics we have this saying that you don't really understand. Sorry, is that better? So I'm prompted by this little quote to think about teaching, actually. And in our field, we always say that you don't really understand a subject within physics until you've tried to teach it. And I think a large reason for that is that when you've sort of absorbed a body of knowledge, you kind of lose the ability to question it in very basic ways. But then when you're trying to explain it for the first time to a set of students who haven't yet really assimilated it, they'll come at you from what feels like left field with all these very basic questions about what you're saying that you probably haven't really thought about before. And that kind of basic questioning is, I think, the sort of thing that really helps you to question what you think you already know about things and to discover what the sort of blind alleys are that you haven't really looked down and places where you still need to go. And the difficulty, I think, then on the research side of things is to try to recover that capability to ask yourself the dumb questions again and not to pretend that you don't need to do that. Because that's where I think the really fundamental progress occurs, is when you can kind of back off and ask questions about what you think you know and not just trying to kind of spread things at the edge.
Okay, we're testing out the mics here, so let me know if you can't hear me. In my practice, which I'm right now really concentrating on my teaching ideas because I'm going to retire soon, so I've got to get it all out really quickly. I would say in my practice of teaching, one of the biggest problems I have is that students actually think they know what it is they want to make. And that my job is to teach them, show them how to make that thing. And it's very difficult to open students' minds up to this question of unknowing or not knowing, and only starting with the most basic questions. Now here I'm talking about perhaps a sophomore level class, not a graduate student. And to me this is a very curious process of coming to meaning in work that at this point they think they know that they want to make this thing, but they really don't even want to think about meaning or anything beyond the fact they see this thing in their mind. And for me, that's the biggest challenge in teaching. And one of the ways my friend Anton Reinders sort of explained it to me is that you can have this triangle of ways of thinking. And in one corner of the triangle is process. And in the other corner is material. And in the third corner is idea. So you've got these three things. And then in the middle of that is meaning. And depending on which part of that is the most critical, whether sometimes the idea is perhaps the most important, or sometimes the process is the most important, and sometimes the material is important. That dot in the center of process and material and idea can move around. And so I think if people can understand the fluidity of that point, it really helps a lot trying to figure out what is this thing that we want to make. Because I think that's the thing about most of us in this room is in the end you want to make something and you don't want to be so saddled with insecurity and unknowing that you physically can't do anything. So that's the challenge as far as I see it.
Responding to the idea of knowing and thinking horizontally, when I started, I'm a conceptual artist, and sometimes I feel like the fact that I'm so involved in ceramics is a little bit of a distraction. But when I started doing ceramics, I had been a philosophy student and also had taken many cultural, I'm not loud enough? Wow. Cultural studies courses. So I was sort of immediately struck by the fact that we had almost a completely constructed imitation Japanese studio in the middle of Indiana. And I thought that was the most interesting thing about ceramics, that we had all ceramic glazes and we had all these kilns, and why was this here? Since that time, I mean, I got really taken with this book I found on Nigerian pottery, and I wanted to know more about West African ceramics, especially after I had learned that traditionally most of those pots were made by women. And I ended up at the Smithsonian Xeroxing these texts from anthropologists primarily, and sometimes missionaries. So we know that these texts are very fraudulent in terms of what they might be telling me or not telling me. So I was always aware that knowledge, and what I also struggle to try to explain to my students at RISD is that knowledge is always dependent on something else. It's always dependent on context or other things you may understand, and it may not be possible to really know what you're doing in ceramics or when you're building this form if you haven't been educated in other areas. So, for example, if you're making dollhouses, if you really haven't thought about gender and sexuality, you may not really know what you're doing. So for me, it's this challenge to always try to figure out the meaning that surrounds the objects that you're making. and the connotations and how you might be carrying an argument forward when you make these objects that you're not aware of. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
I'm struck by Andrea's comment about her students sometimes not being prepared for being in the state of unknowing. And that makes me reflect. I mean, I assume that if you ask a group of artists like yourselves, how do you feel about unknowing? Is it part of your experience? I think most artists are ready to embrace that, or if you haven't thought about it and you're thinking about it, it's an idea you're likely to be receptive to. I think we in the arts may be in the minority in our society in terms of being affirmative about not knowing. I think there are a lot of pressures. We live in a very goal-oriented society. Any of us who've written proposals in science or art have this dilemma of stating at the beginning what the end will look like, when for us it's about that whole exploration that's going to get us there, and we may only have the preliminary questions. You know, in a campaign year, thinking so much about how candidates in a debate just have to have the answers, and we have an educational system that's very much based now on standardized testing, and students coming through 12 or 16 years of an education have been conditioned to deliver answers, not necessarily to think critically. And I'd be interested, Andrea, if you've observed the change over the years in that, actually. So lots of pressures to have answers, to have conclusions, not a lot that sort of reinforces the richness of not knowing and being in a state of questioning and inquiry. I think one of my big connections to this idea of not knowing comes from my 15 years of work with Liz Lerman relative to the critical response process that she shared yesterday, and that has shifted in a big way my orientation to the idea of work in progress. I think there was a time when if I heard that phrase, I thought that meant that things were sort of unresolved, unfinished, tentative, not ready for a public, kind of don't bother me with it until you're finished. And now, having sat through hundreds of sessions with people who are in the midst of work in progress, I now talk about work in progress as the wonderful freedom of not being finished, a place of openness and inquiry, a place where you actually are challenged in your not knowing to make discovery, and that really is the ideal for us of what happens in critique, that the creative process doesn't get the push-hold button pushed on it, but that it actually gets to thrive inside the moment of critique and recapitulate itself to a place where real discovery can happen in the articulation and sometimes the struggle within articulation as well.
I wonder what you guys think about process-heavy materials like ceramics, where the act of working, the act of being in the studio generates the idea, versus where I assume in science you start with an idea and you try to analyze it. I think in process-heavy materials, of which ceramics is one, it's often the back and forth you have with the material itself that generates thought and generates idea. So I'd love to hear you guys talk about how you think about work in progress, as John talked about, either through your teaching or through your own ideas. So how the act of working generates other iterations of a project, and how the next iteration informs the last and then generates more thought for the next one.
Yeah, I would actually like to kind of respond on a couple of points quickly to both of what John was just saying and what Ben just tossed in. Maybe to take Ben's issue first, I would actually say that, no, it's not really the case that in good science, let's say, you start out with some preconceived vision about what you're trying to do and then you just do it. That's kind of like this thing that John just said about how in a proposal you're supposed to talk about the end before you get there. And certainly some work can be done like that, but I don't think that's particularly adventurous or significant work. I think more often in science we like to try to propagate a creative process which is not unlike what goes on in the clay studio, where you don't really know what you're making sometimes until you're finished, or at least the thing that you actually end up with may look very different than what you thought you were trying for when you started, because you have to adapt to circumstances and responses. Something doesn't work out the way that you thought it would, or you realize there was something even better you could do kind of along the way that you went there. And it's very important to be open to that kind of serendipity. Otherwise, I think that really puts a cap on how creative and far-reaching your work can be. And so to connect that a little bit with what John was saying, and this is, I think, also on the same track, often in school maybe you hear about the scientific method, and this is something that you are taught in science class. And I would offer the following synopsis of the way scientific method really works. So you're studying some area or trying to prove something, and the first thing that you do is you make a best effort to take an educated guess at something, and then you do everything you possibly can to try to prove yourself wrong. And I think what's really the kind of core of modern science is giving you a toolkit to try to prove yourself wrong about things. And so, if you believe in that working method, you have to kind of accept that, well, a lot of the beliefs that you have that go into making those educated guesses, some of them actually aren't right. And so you then have to accept that, well, your knowledge is all kind of contingent, right? You have this working body of knowledge that helps you to move forward, but at any point in time, you should be prepared to go back and kind of reorganize that and change some things. And so it strikes me that that's not so different than the process of critique that John was just bringing up. And so in a certain sense in science, because we were talking about relatively objective things, there is a process for self-critique. But I think, it's maybe not so dissimilar to what goes on in an artistic critique, where maybe not so much your beliefs about natural phenomena or the things that have to get revised, but maybe you're thinking about what your intention is or where you're going, and that all has to be re-examined and constantly revised under feedback from others, under your own attempts to articulate things, et cetera.
Thanks. I'm still thinking about what you just said. I think this problem between, this is where I really want to start, is I think the reason why most of us are sitting in this room is because there's something about this material we call clay that has somehow captured our imagination in ways that other materials simply don't have. And part of that, I think, is something about an interest in process and an interest in materiality that's quite different than, my undergraduate degree was in painting at RISD, and, we just really didn't talk about that way. But there's something about the minute you squeeze that piece of clay in your hand, I see it with students. They either, occasionally, they hate it and, they just make it through the semester, and other times they've never touched it before, and that reaction sometimes to me is quite unusual. But this idea that clay has this ability to be anything, and that process is such an integral part of it, and that if you are in a situation where you can really learn the whole process from beginning to end, it's really quite magical. To me, there's a real magic in the unity molecular formula, which is a way to develop glazes. And I love sort of thinking about the magic of the melt. And on the other end of it, there's a sort of magic of what I tell my students, which is there's no such thing as mistake, there's only opportunities. And so, getting back to the glaze, one thing I love about having students who don't know much mix glazes, that as long as they write down what they did, we never know what might come out of that mix. So, for instance, Sin Young's snowflake glaze is invented by a young woman who didn't know the difference between magnesium and manganese. And those of you who are laughing know that there's a difference. So for me, this idea of materiality and process goes through the whole system of ceramics. And to sort of integrate that and ask questions about it all stages is something that I just absolutely I marvel at all the time when I see mistakes, when I see wondrous results out of the kiln. We say, how did that happen? And, and that way of thinking then can develop into very conceptual work. I am working with a graduate student right now who isn't firing things. He's hanging himself from the wall and, doing work that is really very much still about process and material, but is going in a very different conceptual place where, in fact, Simone, I think my biggest problem with teaching is my lack of ability to ask about what's the meaning of making a dollhouse. Because was not part of my training. You're bringing those questions of gender and ethnicity and all of that to the table, I think is the most important place right now. So I really liked what you said about that.
Oh, thank you. I have a very uneasy and I would even maybe say fraught relationship with the ceramic community for a lot of reasons, and I think one of the reasons is what Ben was pointing to is this idea that all ceramic ideas come out of the process itself. And it is such a seductive and a wonderful experience doing ceramics. I understand why many people are really taken by the therapeutic qualities of the process. However, I feel, and one of the things I really learned from Katie Schimmer at RISD that I think I didn't realize is one of the reasons why I've been more comfortable in other arenas is that in the clay community, the insularity I feel stems from not inviting other people who have no sympathy for the way in which the object was made. And it's really important to have those people come in and look at ceramic work that will describe it. And it's almost like, I feel like only involving other ceramic people in your ceramics is like learning from your mother. I mean, it's like a great support system, but it's not always the best criticism because she is aware of how much it took you to get there. And that sympathy can really undermine her ability to be critical. And so that's all I really wanted to say about that. It's just to consider bringing in people to critique and view your work who will not be engaged in the process and will not know how hard it was for you to get that temuku glaze or whatever. It's really important to have those people around and often, I think.
I have to say, I also got hooked by your reference, Simone, to the dollhouse and gender. And my first thought was, gee, gosh, I'm just really interested in miniatures. Isn't that enough, Yeah. I'd really like to just play with that. And yet, actually, Dollhouse, in essence, is a language. Yeah. And those who are steeped in the language are those who probably have a gender relationship, a gender-based relationship to that form. And so you push the question of knowing and not knowing also to a responsibility to kind of always expand our grasp of the languages we want to use, which I think is a really interesting challenge. Because part of this discussion I'm feeling is sort of giving us permission to be in that not knowing. But from you, Simone, I hear sort of a charge but that also entails the expansion of the universe of what we do know and understanding the images, forms, and languages that we take on. Getting to your question about process-heavy materials, it's not being in ceramics, it's not a phrase I'm used to. I can reflect a little bit on all kinds of experiences of watching people in a big variety of forms show their work when it's work in progress. And the big variety of what that means at the beginning of a process as opposed to towards the end of the process. How the dimension of what we know and what we don't know shifts depending on whether we're in the early divergent phases of making as opposed to the later convergent phases of making. It's interesting, somebody does a dance solo in the form in which critical response kind of originated, and you can actually have them get up and do it again at the end of a critique session and try some new things right in front of you. And that's a really interesting malleability to that form. In photography, which is the medium that I teach, you can put a bunch of prints down on the table and move them around and look at their relationships and talk about context and turn some of them over and suggest what would happen if we reshot this. And so there's a dynamic that happens by virtue of looking at things. In forms that are durational, you can't talk and look at the same time, and that creates another interesting dynamic. It's always interesting with visual art in particular, and I'm curious about this in ceramics given the nature of the various stages of process that a ceramic piece goes through. Are you looking at, I've looked at work in progress that was literally it's a painting. You see some of the underpainting, some parts filled out, some sketched in. It's really half done, and you can talk about it. I've seen people show bodies of work and say, this is a growing body of work, and the next things I'm thinking about are X. So that's a different kind of relationship to process and the materials. And then, when we look at student work, often we're talking about that student in a way as the work in progress, and where do they want to take their bigger vision and intention in relationship to their training and development of practice.
Can I respond to that just a bit? Kind of on these issues of material and meaning. Last night we were having a brief conversation when the whole subject of artist statements came up. And I was saying that it was something that struck me in my own field of physics was that we've kind of gotten to a point in our field where what you say about what you do is kind of more important than what you've actually done. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and this prompted interesting contributions from the artist side. But I would actually go so far as to say that for some of us who work in ceramics but maybe don't rely on selling things for a living, like for me, I don't really feel that what I say about what I have made is really that important. And in fact, I don't really feel like what I've made is so important compared to the process of making. When I'm asked to provide an artist statement for something, I often respond in a kind of a glib way, but I think it tries to get at something that I really mean. And I just say, making is searching. You don't really know what you're looking for, but sometimes you find clues, and that's what drives you forward. And because I actually have this feeling like searching, that kind of blind searching, which really keeps you in this place of not knowing, I feel that's such good for you. It's just good for you as a human being. And ceramics is actually a wonderful medium in which to kind of conduct that search. So, I feel that the materiality of it is what's one of the very attractive things about ceramics, and something that makes it very complementary to other kinds of artistic or scientific expression.
I'd love to hear what the rest of the panel thinks about the artist statement and how that can be either a vehicle to get farther with an idea or how it can actually be a trap.
Well, I think I'm being called upon here. This is the artist statement season. It's March. Seniors and second-year graduate students have now, perhaps in most schools, been told they better have this piece of paper. Some schools find that more important than other schools. The writing of that statement can be taken very seriously, even within the same school, very seriously and not very seriously. Even amongst the faculty at Alfred, with 6 people there, I can tell you that over the years, people have taken very different attitudes from don't you dare write that thing to let's spend half an hour every week talking about it. Where I am right now is this thing we thought up in a recent meeting where we're not going to call it an artist statement. We're going to call it the written statement, because the artist statement is really the work, and the written statement is to support that work. And somehow, for me, what I've found is the process and the writing of it has become much more critical than the finished product. The finished product in the end is somebody sits down and corrects all the grammar and makes sure the period and the question marks are in the right place. But I find the written statements are much more useful as a list of words or a letter that you start. I just have one in my bag. I just remembered I brought it. It's called Dear God. This is what I think about my work. I need to explain it to you. And by actually going through that piece of paper, as I imagine an English teacher, which I'm not, would do, and said, okay, these are the verbs. Let's look at these verbs and how you've chosen these verbs to use in describing your work. And then let's look at the nouns, and then let's look at these other words. And somehow by looking at these words, it became clear to me that this student knew exactly what they were trying to do with their work. It wasn't a brilliant artist statement, but the seeds were in there. They were in those list of words. And that gave me a great insight and questions to ask about the work and to talk to the student about the work. Whether it's going to be a great written statement in the end, I don't know, but it really was very helpful for me. And that's probably the thing I've learned by taking on this statement thing more seriously in the last few years. I used to just blow it off and say, I don't know, you might write one or you might not. But I really think the process, this work in progress, has, for me, become a more important part of my teaching, is to try to get that to happen at some point.
Did you want me to respond?
I wanted actually you to talk about how language comes into your work in terms of the way that you think about your own work, and if you write before, during, or after a piece is done.
Well, I guess, I'm in a different place thinking about this than Andrea Gill, because for me, not having the ability to write about your work is unprofessional. So it's a different place you might be in than when you're a student. And I actually work with my students to write artist statements, and for me it's a vehicle to try to help them to start thinking about other things than form, or how did I get this, to come out of the kiln without a crack. I think every artist struggles with these statements, but I also think it's important whether you are, that you are the person who historicizes what you have made and what it means. And I think it is true in art as well as what Hideo was saying in science, is that the way a work is historicized has a lot more life. But even also in photography, like I meet people who say they love my work all the time, but they actually haven't seen it. They've only seen photographs of it, and they've read about it. For me, it's just another platform to disperse ideas. And maybe not having that ability is dysfunctional professionally, but also I think that through my struggle to get better and better at being able to write about my work, it's always made my work better. Even though it has been painful, I never feel like it's undermined me in any way. So even though I feel sorry that the onus is on artists to also do all these other projects around their work. It's helped me, so I stopped complaining about it.
I got an MFA late in life. Just a couple of years ago, I was in an MFA program, so kind of fresh from the angst of, and it was a program that put a big premium on the artist statement, fresh from the collective angst of developing these. But I also come from 20 years as an arts administrator, working in that aspirational exercise of the grant proposal with somebody as brilliant as Liz Lerman, and discovering how much is gained by the act of articulation and meeting that challenge and contextualization. And I love this idea that Simone just shared of you being the one who historicizes your own work. Does anybody familiar with the radio and podcast series On Being with Krista Tippett? Yeah. I'm a big fan of them, and I recently listened to one where she interviewed a botanist named Robin Wall Kimmerer, She is a Native American who has worked in the highest echelons of science as a botanist, but has also really worked to encourage the perpetration, the propagation and recognition of what's called indigenous knowledge. And she talks about how if you're functioning in a purely scientific way, sometimes the classification and naming of something becomes the end. So once something is articulated and named, the exploration ends, whereas in the indigenous tradition, there's kind of an ongoing conversation with the organism that is constant. And I thought that was a really inspiring idea. There were so many things she said in this podcast, actually, that were relevant to this conversation, and I really encourage people to take a listen to it. But so I guess I would say, as Simone is emphasizing, for professional artists, for artists who are living and working in a societal context, at some point things at least pass through a period of articulation, whether that's the statement or the critique, but it is not the only way of knowing, and it is not the end of knowing. And we as artists need to also perpetuate all those other ways we have of knowing simultaneously and keep it all going and let them inform one another.
Simone, your comment about historicizing your own work and that the artist has the power and should take the power to do that is interesting to me relative to the power that critics have in the art world. So I was thinking about the multi-level tiers of communication in the art world, and I think there's the artist, then there's the art dealer, which often has something else to say than the artist. Then there's the critic, who builds on those two, hopefully adding something new. And then there's the historian or the museum that's then adding a fourth level. So can you talk about the role of the critic and how that plays into this discussion of defining creativity once the artist has let go of the work?
Well, I have, it's been interesting because I don't really know the arc of being a critic, and the critics that I think of that immediately come to mind have really varied backgrounds. But I do know that when I came to New York and was making pots, most critics and curators and even our historians told me that I was not making art. And now that's shifted, where I'm like making pots in a new museum. So I think that it's important to be discursive and in dialogue with critics, and it's also important to stand your ground. So I think that it's important if you really, have a clear idea to not, I don't know, I'm really feeling two ways about it. And in some ways I feel that after resisting a lot of change and resisting the critique of my colleagues and other critics, there were some important things about that. And then I also think that my work grew when I did start to listen. So I'm finding it difficult to respond because I'm feeling both ways about it.
Do any of you have thoughts on the critic?
Well, I guess as I'm sitting here, I'm still thinking about writing, sorry, because I'm going back to my own education, which was in the late 60s and early 70s. And quite honestly, I don't think anybody, professors, friends, anybody, ever asked me to write anything and themselves never wrote anything. That the closest people got to that was perhaps an interview. That in fact, some artists' books even at the time were interviews. And there were a few artists who were then becoming authors and writing, but generally speaking, it just wasn't part of the educational process. And this idea that now writing is that it's unprofessional to not write about your work really is, I think, a very contemporary point of view, which is putting language much more at the forefront of what we do than it used to be. And I think this leaves some people in a little bit of a quandary because what they do doesn't seem to have a tremendous literary component. I mean, I'm thinking of students who really are absolutely embedded in wanting to become studio potters. And it is a very particular way of thinking. And yes, you can become, and Linda Sikora, of course, is a very good writer, is one of our pottery teachers. There are ways to talk about that, but, and to write about it, and more is happening about that. But I guess I just had to say that it's difficult for those people who've been out there in the field for a while to really embrace this as part of their practice. So it's just, I think it's the growth of the industry, but I think those people who don't feel comfortable writing, just do it, just take out a pad of paper. My husband's sitting in the back there. He said he wouldn't come. But John is unusual in that his ability to write himself sort of stopped around the 6th grade, but his ability to think has never stopped growing. And so I become a scribe for his ideas because, I have to separate out writing from thinking and put them together. So that's just a personal note on that it's a very scary thing for a lot of people, but I think it's true. But I think what you said is that somehow writing and physically writing has become much more a part of both of our fields than it used to be.
Yeah, I was actually going to respond. I quite resonate with what Simone was saying about that kind of double-edged sword of criticism. In science, we don't really have physics critics, right? So it's more like the question of how your work is received by your colleagues. And if there is something that's defined my work in the recent past, is that I've gone off in directions that nobody else really cares about. And so, people often say that Hideo, he's a smart guy, but I wish he would do something relevant. And I like to think that I do that because I think that what we're doing is really important. And if other people don't follow, well, too bad. But that is a double-edged sword. That there is this importance of standing your ground and saying, no, this is really what I think we ought to be doing right now, and I'm just going to do it, even if you don't appreciate it. But on the other hand, there is this thing where the impact of your work is not just that someday, 20 years from now, some student's going to dig up your paper and have this revelatory moment of, oh, that's what I needed to know. But it's also that your impact in the current day has to do with how much you influence the work of your colleagues. And I think that if you stray too far away from what other people care about, there's this danger that you're going to become irrelevant to what the community does. And so, that's a kind of feeling that comes up for me listening to Simone talk that, yeah, I also do struggle with that kind of thing quite a bit.
I know 2 artists who are writing essays, and the artwork is actually the essay. So I don't think that this is something that's going to end anytime soon. And I also think that, I think it's important to sort of think about it as another arena that you can take control of, I do think that, I don't know how I would be able to function if I tried to avoid writing about my work entirely.
I guess I think more about an ideal than a reality of how criticism or journalistic criticism or academic criticism works. I do think ultimately all art exists in relationship to an audience. If it's put forward to an audience, then it exists in relationship to an audience. And so the qualities I guess I'm hoping for are a dialogue that creates a sense of, or elicits a sense of context, some sense that I might gain as an artist as to how work is impressing an experience in another person, creating an experience in another person, how that works both individually and collectively. And that is also something I want students to be thinking about. I think we're past the point where considering your work and intention irrespective of an audience is not really going to work, and it's not going to help that artwork contribute to society. So, and when we talk about critique as we do it with critical response process, a lot of it is about sort of trying to grasp what the external experience of the work is as opposed to the internal intention of work.
I want to have one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you guys want to line up at the mics over there, we'll address your questions in just a minute. In Science Hideo, you guys have research groups, and this is something we talked about a little bit yesterday. I'm interested in creativity as it comes from the group mind as opposed to the individual mind. You said something interesting yesterday, that your job was to encourage a little bit of serendipity, I think you said, when you were helping PhD students to work together. So can you talk about the research group?
Sure. There are lots of different ways to run a research group. If you ask a scientist, they'll have their own philosophy about it. I like to try to recruit students into my group who are interested in generally similar things that I'm interested to. And then I try to encourage them to kind of do their own thing. And I view, my job is first of all to find a way to pay for that research. But then also in keeping track of what those people are doing, I try to give little nudges that help to make what they're doing more productive, to be more impactful, but also to recognize if there are 2 or 3 different people who are working on related things, where something new can emerge if they would put those things together. I sort of view that's the creative part of research management, if you will, that really as an academic scientist these days, you have relatively little time to do your own work. So often what you do is you try to do science sort of through the eyes and hands of your students. But the role where the creativity in that comes in is, I think, to try to foster a group environment where people feel free, where the students feel free to really pursue their own thing. But then I'm trying to help recognize when important things start to bubble up and encourage those things, kind of amplify them, help them grow. And often in the group setting, to recognize when there's a certain kind of synergy emerging in what multiple people just happen to be doing at a given point in time. So it's we had a conversation yesterday about how that's not so dissimilar maybe to what happens right in the context of, say, an MFA cohort that are working directly together. I mean, maybe there's less directed leadership there, or maybe there is. I don't know.
Well, yeah, we were talking a bit about this yesterday, and the way I guess I could just sum it up is that when things are working really well in our graduate program, the graduate students, in fact, are that research group. And when we choose our graduate students, we actually try to choose people who we think are making very, very diverse works and putting them in a room together and fighting it out. And seeing how that synergy between completely different points of view, and here again, we're sort of bringing in someone whose goal perhaps is to become a studio artist working as an independent entrepreneur, or someone who takes on very theoretical issues, becomes involved in academia. So, but for me, I wish that every class I taught could think of themselves as a research group, that they are working together, not that they work on a particular project. Students hate these group projects where they all have to make the same thing, but just this idea that if you can engender that thinking and also somehow make them feel that they are on the cutting edge of something really important. One of the best things I ever read was about Clifford Still teaching, really quite honestly, somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Washington State. And one of the students who was in that program at the time, this was back in the 40s, said the greatest thing about Clifford Still teaching was he really made us feel as if we were reinventing the art world, that we were this research group that are really pushing ideas forward. And when I see that happening amongst a group of our students, and sometimes it's a group of our seniors who all work very independently, getting together to work on projects together, to me that's quite remarkable learning, and that's where real learning can take place.
When Hideo talks about research groups in a science context, I'm prompted to think about what sometimes happens with the leadership of a curator in artistic contexts, or what the role of curation is, and the type of thing that can happen when you organize a group of work by different artists around an idea or a theme or some source of connection between them, and how context emerges. We find new ways to look at work by virtue of what's placed next to other work, and what can happen too when you bring artists together under that curational umbrella and they meet each other and are able to have conversations, the potential for sort of collective discovery, collective creativity happening in that context.
So I think we'll open it up to questions. Maybe one from the center aisle.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about privilege, and when we're talking about knowing or not knowing, as you said earlier, it has to do with questioning. And so, for example, as a woman, I'm very comfortable with questioning my place in the world and my place in what I'm doing. As a queer woman, I'm comfortable questioning. But as a white person, I'm comfortable walking through the world without having to ask questions. And I get very uncomfortable if someone questions me and my knowledge regarding that. So I just wanted to ask about privilege and cultural when it comes to questioning and our resistance to that, and maybe the role in keeping us disconnected as a community and also within the community of the clay world.
Can you say something specific, like an example?
Well, just talking specifically about being comfortable with letting go of knowing and knowledge, and being more comfortable with questioning yourself, and being comfortable with people questioning you, and the role that privilege plays in that. If that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. It's just so big.
I know.
Trying to figure out. Do you want to respond?
Do you have something?
I was just going to try to tie it back a little bit to what Liz Lerman was talking about yesterday, just in the context of, I think what you're pointing out is maybe that it's very hard, not knowing, admitting that you don't know,
Yes.
it's an uncomfortable thing. And so really, it's easiest to do if you can start from a place of some security. Right? And so Liz was talking quite a bit about what about the critical response process, or about certain ways of providing feedback can make the artist, let's say, feel comfortable about that, about being in that position. But I think you're quite right that if you broaden the context a little bit to, there are lots of societal reasons where some people are going to be not comfortable with that position of not knowing because they don't have the security underlying it. And so I think it does, when we consider how all of these issues blend in with, the clay community or academia or whatever that larger context is, but I think it's important to be aware that students and peers, they're starting from very, very different places about kind of what security they've had the privilege of enjoying. And so that's something to be sensitive to, I think, in that process of feedback and criticism.
Thank you.
When we do trainings in the critical response process where we have enough time to really explore, one of the things that we will often do is a kind of cultural mapping exercise where we ask people in the group to respond to a series of questions, some of which probe their family backgrounds, things like their own personal preferences in terms of how they like to have conversations. Though it's often fraught, we try to probe a little bit into cultural background and influence of gender. And you know, we discover a lot of variation actually in a given group about, for instance, whether, you know, are we comfortable with unknowing is one question, but also how, from our cultural backgrounds, is it okay to ask a question? Is that something that's reinforced or something that could have gotten you in a lot of trouble historically? I think one of the challenges of coming together in dialogue about work is to sort of recognize all of these forces that are in the room with us when we discuss any given piece of work, and increasingly for those of us who've come through to our experience with, by virtue of a degree of privilege, recognizing that privilege. But the real challenge is, you know, can we all be in the room together? If we're in the room together discussing work, is there a way we can do it that sort of acknowledges some of that difference? And it's an ongoing question for us, Liz and me and others working with critical response process, as to whether it it provides an antidote for multiple cultural biases, or whether the process itself has its own built-in cultural bias. That's a question we continue to look at and explore.
I'm just writing a few words down. It seems to me privilege is a hierarchical connotation. And if you think back to Liz Lerman talking last night about horizontality, if there's some way that we could build this feeling of horizontality into our thinking so that privilege no longer matters, where you're coming into that horizontal culture doesn't matter. So I think that's the one thing that maybe I'd like to say. The other thing is that it always seems to boil down to this place where you feel secure enough to feel like it's okay to ask questions and to not know. And that security and that trust has to be built within a group. We're not really talking, when you talk about trust, you're not talking about individuality, you're almost always talking about a group. And to me, that's the thing that, if we could figure that out, if we could figure out how privilege is simply a place on a horizontal line of the hierarchy of our culture, things might change, but that's simply not where we are right now. And I wish I had a better answer to it.
I think that just to give one example of one way I think I try to deal with this problem is I noticed in many of my classes that women would start their conversation by apologizing. So I just ban apologizing. And I also talk about it and say why I'm banning apologizing, and I think sometimes maybe a way to begin is to just talk about it and to name what's happening.
One of the things Liz says about how the critical response process can work is to turn all that impulse to apology and excuses into vivid questions for yourself. Turn it into inquiry.
Question from over here.
Can you hear me? In 2010, Malcolm Davis gave the closing keynote at NCECA, and he said something along the lines of, "Are we just playing in the mud while Rome burns?" And he was addressing our work as ceramic artists in relation to the rest of society's problems. How do you all address the fact that art solves different problems than science or engineering? Do you feel obligated to encourage your students to create not just meaning, but meaning that helps solve some of society's toughest problems?
You guys only ask the big questions. I appreciate that.
Can I jump in on that? I guess, relative to this idea of unknowing, I think one of the functions I see art serving is to help us live in a world of vast paradox and ambiguity. So I want the role of that to be valued And sometimes it's difficult to see how a given artwork that takes us to that place of living inside the unknowing, the ambiguities, it's hard to see how it solves the problems. And yet, allowing us to occupy that space, I think, is hugely important.
I'm going to offer the last time that Liz and I were together on a panel, something like this, our conversation really turned towards the idea of applied art, and if it's useful to think of such a thing. In the sciences, we are very used to thinking that there are pure sciences, or there's maybe pure physics, fundamental physics, and then there's applied physics. I'm actually a professor of applied physics. And so we just started wondering whether it might be useful to imagine such a notion also in art, that you might think that there's pure art and then there's applied art. And I was saying about science that I think the best applied science has this aspect that it addresses or contributes to addressing some societal need, but at the same time motivates or requires some fundamental growth in the pure part of the field as well. And so I think it's an interesting question for artists of every kind to ask whether a certain kind, a similar kind of axis exists. You know, because in science and engineering, there are certainly people who work on problems that contribute only very, very, very indirectly to society. But you know, in the long run, that's good for the field because it generates a richer context in which future people can do their very applied work.
I think that no artist has any responsibility to do anything for anyone, but I think that the way white supremacy works is to create these ideas of normativity. So I'm just a person, this is just clay, we're just sitting here at the wheel, I'm just a potter, and that my race, ethnicity, gender, class, none of these things are relevant because I'm just making a pot right now. And I think that that's not true, and that the artist does herself a disservice to believe that those things are true, and that this idea that all of those things fall away or there's somehow a distraction from the real thing, which is, you know, my experience, my sensual or other experiences making this pot. I think that that's not true. And I think that if more people thought about those other arenas, then ceramics would be useful, more useful to other kinds of, it would have more social import and would be more celebrated, I think, and would be more interesting and would be more available to work in interdisciplinary ways, and I think that would advance us socially.
I've never felt that art in itself could solve any problems whatsoever, and that perhaps, in fact, its best place would be to point to problems, that art, in fact, points to a problem and hopefully pokes at the problem. Hopefully it someday might pierce the bubble of the problem. You know, Simone, the argument about the white, the normal, this normal person sitting at their normal wheel with some normal clay sitting in front of them, and that's a position of privilege. I don't know what to do about that. I'm not sure about it because we talk about this within our program. And is it enough to know that that normal only exists because of a cultural condition? And then how does that artist contribute? How do they place themselves in the world? Do you understand what I'm asking? I'm not sure how to address this problem with my students about this question of the normative when it comes to making ceramic things. And do they have to be, how much they have to be self-knowledgeable about where they are? But what then must they address it?
For me, it's, I have to go back to the idea of the dollhouse. I do think that thinking about the content that's inherent in a dollhouse when you make a dollhouse, and being aware of that, and thinking about your relationship to that idea of gender that you're sort of like conjuring up by making that form manifest in the world, and putting it in a gallery, will make that person a better artist, and will also give that person a language with which to have discourse with other artists, which I think is a part of being an artist. But how we address this idea of the normative, I think, is really not standing in that space and not creating this idea that there's this, I mean, I think I've heard people say things like, I don't see color, or, you know, I don't see race, people are just people. And I just think that that's like very nice, but it's not solving the problem. It's not acknowledging that you're not racist. It's, I mean, a lot of times what people, the difference between like not being racist and being anti-racist, it's not about what you're not doing. I mean, maybe you should be acknowledging that you do have an ethnicity. I mean, it's like no one does not have one. So just pretending like that just people of color have ethnicity and you don't is a way of like reaffirming a hierarchy in this passive way that I'm sure that most people would not want to. So just those kinds of things, I mean.
Question from the center.
Yeah. Wow, it's a lot to wrap my mind around. Thank you for leading by example and helping the public and this audience today explore the idea of unknowing and grow through the anxiety of the pause. Maybe it's okay to have a little space and wonder. What I want to know is, because you've made me think now about artists as communicators and how dangerous it is to use common language, simple terms like dollhouse, and all these people. There's 100 different ideas and subsets occurring once we label. But what I love here is there's curiosity and we're poking further. How do we overcome that in today's world where someone at the end of a computer is looking and they don't see your work, they see your blurb. They have ideas when they read a word and it's limited to your audience. In other words, using common terms, their idea when you say racist or privilege, what they define that as, it limits what they'll understand by your communication. So we have these mediums like science and art and our words. How do we overcome that? I guess I prefer a dialogue. I'd rather, if I see Simone's work, I'd love to have her next to it and talk with her. Obviously that can't happen. How do we overcome that in today's world as artists? Sorry, that's big.
I'm not sure what the
sorry.
question
Not
was.
sorry.
It was wonderful, but I'm not sure what, could you restate the question?
As artists, maybe in one level of being an artist, as a communicator of ideas, and the idea being unknowing or pushing a definition of a term like dollhouse, making someone see more than they saw before. How do you overcome that in today's world where all they're going to read is a blurb or maybe see it on a screen and it won't necessarily affect them? How can you convey such complicated thoughts?
I think what I don't understand is when you say see the blurb and see it on the screen.
You're conveying words and people don't, they have their own definition and it's limiting. So, I guess my question doesn't make sense.
You mean like when you read about work in a magazine or online?
Yeah, and your audience doesn't, maybe they have ideas like you just said, well, okay, this is about race, but I'm not really a racist, and they kind of move on because they define that, they feel something and they just sort of move on, it's limiting.
Well, it's this whole idea that race is somehow about other people, that white people don't have a race, that they don't have an ethnicity. It's just an illusion, and it is a way of just, not engaging in the world. It's, the advantage of being a person of color is that you don't have even the opportunity to do that. So you don't, you always are thinking horizontally because of your position in this culture. But actually everyone does have a race. Everyone's work is about identity. Everyone else does have a gender. It's not just something that, gender isn't something that women have. And so that's the way we use these terms.
Yeah,
it's like
and there are
gender,
so many
you mean a woman.
men
You know what I
that
mean? And it's
are
like
equal. Yeah.
So that's what I mean. It's like maybe dispelling this idea that you're somehow outside of these arenas. So sorry. Can help.
I mean, I'm not an artist, but what I hear you asking is something about the problem where most of your audience never really has a direct experience of your work. It's something that Simone also said, but they only have this kind of weird mediated experience of your work. And the same thing I was saying earlier is kind of happening in science. And it's sort of just a problem of information overload, right? There's so much artwork you can look at on the web, there's so much science that you can learn about on the web that people feel like they don't have time for that direct experience, and so they look for that mediated blurb, right? The kind of Huffington Post or whatever. But I think that's a really big societal problem. I don't know that there's anything that the individual person can do about that. That kind of seems like something that a community of artists or a community of scientists really needs to address to kind of bring back the value that people have for a direct experience of anything, right? Nature, art, science. And sometimes I think there are people out there who are thinking about that kind of thing. I've recently been reading Kenya Hara. I don't know if anybody knows him. He's a designer, who works for companies that are like Gap or big companies like that. And he talks about how the designer's role is to really subtly re-educate the culture of the people, and sort of trying to help them see the value in unbranded things, right? So I think there's a really big, something that requires collective action, I think, to address that particular problem you're talking about.
I'm hearing part of the issue as about there are certain things within the control of the artist and there are certain things outside the control of the artist in terms of how work is represented or what's said or what reductive language can be used to represent something. I don't know that that's truer now than it's been in the past. I do think that we have tools that we didn't used to have in terms of our ability to represent our own work. And I'm always looking for ways to have artistry inform more of what an artist does. So I'm less interested in hearing you talk about how you're distracted by having to write a blurb than in hearing you talk about how writing the blurb is part of your artistry. So is it possible for an artist to be thinking about everything they put into the world as being a dimension of their artwork? And that might include blurbs and social media presence. It's all an extension of an idea that they want to represent. And I think, yes, there are challenges that we face now, but there are also some great opportunities as well.
It just seems to me you're asking a question of language. And again, I'll bring it back to this idea that we could think today about horizontality in a different way. I think I said something to Simone before we started where I said this is the new hot word is horizontality. The fact that gender has become a word that we use all the time. The words do enter the culture and make us question things. And the artist, I think, oftentimes is just responding to the words. Like I might go home and really think about horizontality, and it might end up that I'll make something that somehow addresses that in a very physical way because I'm curious about it. So to me, this problem of how words become and take on meaning is a very rich part of our culture, and what we need to do now, I think, is really educate this problem that ethnicity doesn't mean we're automatically talking about people of color, that we all have ethnicity. So that's about my comment, but maybe you could.
Chris?
Yeah, when I talk to students, they often say there's this real paradox or conflict in their art education, and they say they're being asked to really embrace the unknown, to take risks, to play, but at the same time, they're also being asked to explain the meaning behind their work and feel like they need, in these questions, need to really know what they're doing in their work. And they say it's like doing two things that are incongruous with one another, and that creates a tremendous amount of sort of confusion. And I was wondering if you might address that polemic that's happening in education.
What kind of school do you work at? Art school or a liberal arts college?
It's a large university with an art school in the university.
Well, I guess, do you mind if I jump in? You know, Chris, I think that it's the professor, it's the teacher who must help the student see the meaning in their work. That, to me, the ideal situation would be a situation where the student really does feel they're in the place of the unknown and in playing and really just exploring the media, and then sort of in Les Lehrman's place, me coming along with an observation about that work that is, for me, suggesting a seed of meaning. And then I might say, well, why don't you go look at so-and-so's work? Why don't you read this essay that seems to me have something to do with this rather odd object that you just made when you were playing around? Because I really believe in the authenticity of making, that it in fact does inform who we are and what we think and what we do. But without that mentor coming in, of course, this is the mentor conference, the mentor coming in and pointing to meaning in a very neutral way. I think last night Liz used this idea about, you know, that choice of that careless piece of wood, you know, and pointing that out. To me, that's how education takes place. So I don't know if that helps.
Thank you.
I mean, if I would jump in with a kind of science analogy, I feel that tension is also there in trying to create creative scientists. That, I mean, I feel like it's important to get students in the habit of embracing that process of playful exploration, but that at the end of the day, they do have to say what they're doing and why it's important. But to me, I think that ability to do the last bit, to really talk about meaning, at least in science, that comes very late in the game because it requires perspective and broad knowledge. And, you know, I think in the sciences, I think it's important to just make the process a habit from day one. But then what you teach them in the classroom, not in the studio per se, but in the classroom, is that breadth of understanding that they can recognize the meaning that emerges out of a process like that. And, you know, not to be tied to aiming at a specific thing when you start out, but sort of recognizing what is the significance, what is the meaning of this thing as it emerges. And I think that's an essential part of actually creative scientific process as well as in the studio arts.
I do think that the two things are contradictory, but I don't feel like that ends after being in a university, and the only way to really manage that is to become more knowledgeable, and oftentimes that may mean seeking knowledge outside of the studio. But I do think I think it's very difficult being a student, but I also think it's really difficult being an artist for similar reasons. Because you know, I'm always trying to protect that place of inquiry and fumbling around and failure. Constantly, I mean, especially now it's harder because I'm making work that becomes public, and it's much harder to have a big failure. So it continues, but and sometimes I'm actually jealous of my students because they can, you know, explore widely, or you decide to be a different artist tomorrow than they were yesterday. But I think the only way to really be more comfortable in that is to really expand your knowledge outside of the classroom. I always feel like context is one of the easiest ways to get to meaning.
One of the most valuable ideas I gained from my own recent MFA education is this idea of praxis, which my best articulation of it is that it's the cyclical relationship between the doing and the making and the theory that you can draw out of it, and that there's a constant cycle going on between those things. And I would encourage students to live in the mess of that constant cycle which means that yes, sometimes you are playing and exploring, but there's ongoing inquiry that helps you draw information out of that can inform the next round. And if we stop you in any given moment, you might be doing one or the other, but you need to sort of live in a world where you're doing both. That's really what artistry is.
Thank you.
So we are unfortunately out of time. If you still have some questions, I think the panel might be able to talk to you a little bit after the presentation is over. I just want to have you guys give them all a round of applause.